But today, our content, and it's about a half hour, is actually related to a graduate program that we've been developing with the University of Southern California Rossier School of Education, one of the best schools of ed in all the world. And it's called Trauma Readiness, or T3 certification, what it means to become trauma-informed, trauma-skilled, and trauma-ready. And at the end of the presentation, I'll tell you how to access some of that if you are interested. Our agenda today, we want to think about what is trauma readiness, and we're going to expand our conversation to go just beyond school violence, even though Alyssas Law explicitly began as a conversation around school violence. We will, however, look at some statistics from the FBI and Homeland Security, FEMA, and then we'll make a connection to the Alyssas Law. I would note, although I'm specifically speaking to the Florida legislation today, Alyssas Law has become law in many states and really stemmed from the Parkland shootings here in Florida. And then we have some recommendations. So to begin, I hope you're all ready to chat it up a little bit. So get your typing fingers ready and just respond in the chat box. Give us a sense. Do you currently have a trauma readiness plan? Do you have a trauma readiness plan? In your school district or in your school building, have you thought about what it means to be trauma ready, how you're going to respond? And that really just starts us off, because when we think about trauma readiness, whatever was in the back of your mind, I'm wondering, I kind of want to poke at, does your trauma readiness plan include, for instance, bullying or a student-on-student incident? What are we going to do if there is bullying? Which, by the way, bullying doesn't necessarily mean that there was an act of violence. If you look at the statistics, the majority of secondary students indicate that they have been bullied or threatened in the last week, even though the majority of those threats weren't acted upon. Is there a medical emergency? And we have some statistics a little bit later on about how many of us have a plan for medical emergency. We don't follow it. The sudden death of a student or staff. Sometimes that could be a student or a staff person taking their own life, or maybe they were in a car accident, or today that could actually be a COVID related death. A catastrophic event, a natural event or a random event. That could be something like a hurricane or a fire, that kind of item. And then you have the catastrophic event, which is school violence, like a school shooting. You have something called latent trauma. So latent trauma is trauma that shows up after the fact. Right now, we should all be expecting and planning for latent trauma as our kids and our staff come back into school. And by the way, that isn't just about someone was sick or died or whatnot. I'm going to have trauma because let's say I'm a kid and my parents got divorced, or there was a lot of arguing in my house over the past several months because everyone was cooped up together. That can be traumatic in and of itself, as well as I lost a grandparent because of COVID, et cetera. Or with the staff, I got divorced, or my spouse lost their job. All of those things can lead to latent trauma. And then lastly, you have secondary trauma. Secondary trauma is often what's called the caregiver effect. And that can be the impact of caring for so many others who have traumatic needs that I myself am traumatized. So when you think about what a trauma readiness plan is, what it means to be trauma aware or trauma skilled or trauma ready, are we thinking about the broad range of kinds of trauma? There's actually an index for each of these. So I can be trauma aware. That means I know something. That you could be generally aware. But that scale goes all the way to the idea of being expert. And that's a deep awareness reaching the classroom level, not just stopping at a principal or at a counselor or at a first responder, but all the way to the classroom level. And that's trauma awareness. And then you have the actual skills, fluent trauma prevention, and then having a fluent skills, so you have automated response or automatic response if something happens. And on the skill scale there, it's from novice to fluency, again, fluent in the classroom. My teachers know what to do to prevent trauma or to respond. And that's what we mean by trauma skilled. And lastly, the readiness scale goes from strategic, which is big thinking, right? Lots of district plans, strategic plans, to very explicit operational plans, plans that are tested in the same way we have fire drills. We have a trauma response drill, and that could be to a variety of different kinds of items, which really focuses on the staff's capacity or ability to respond autonomically. And that is the tested classroom operational plan. So as we think about this broader definition of trauma and our plans, and if we are aware of these and we are skilled in the response, we want to think about, do we have a systemic method of identifying the underlying trauma as a part of prevention? All right. What are the factors that would lead to those kinds of traumatic items? The way we identify them, our reporting practices, and immediate intervention. And this actually becomes important, not just for some of these broad items, right? Thinking about maybe a medical emergency, or is the student having some psychological issue related to things at home? But if you look at school violence, and again, we're broadening our conversation, but explicitly here, because I know many of you are concerned about that, the FBI has published a variety of content, which we'll send to you, by the way, a couple of their really interesting papers on stressor awareness and predisposing factors. They talk about precipitating stressors, could be incidents or different kinds of circumstances in the home, reactions, situations, which trigger a threat. And there's this idea of an emotional chain reaction. And by the way, if you look at school violence, if you look at school shootings, but also if you look at bullying that ends up with acting out, there's almost always an emotional chain reaction. And one of the things that the FBI helps us to think about is, are there predisposing factors that we can identify inside of the classroom with, for instance, our students? It could be a personality trait or a characteristics or a temperament that leads us to think about how we intervene beforehand, before this gets out of hand or it becomes a problem. And by the way, if you look at the really terrible tragedies that have occurred in American schools, most of those were actually conducted by a student, and the student was almost always known to faculty and staff as having some of these predisposing factors. The FBI provides a 4-prong assessment model of a school shooter, looking at the personality of the student, looking at the family dynamics, looking at the school dynamics and the student's role in those dynamics. For instance, are they a bully? Is this a student who is often bullied by others, which is more likely the case? And then the social dynamics. And again, we'll send you the white paper on that, but for our purposes today, we want to be thinking about what's our plan? How do we address that? How do we identify some of those things so we can intervene early before anything becomes a problem? Beyond thinking about just kind of very specific school shootings or the kinds of things that the FBI has written about, we have the concept of adverse childhood experiences. And actually, you can buy formalized evaluations of adverse childhood experiences. We have some information we'll send to you. But an ACE can be anything from there was a divorce in the student's family, to a death, to the family doesn't have enough food, so they're hungry, these kinds of things, lots of different kinds of experiences. In the United States, 45% of all students have at least one adverse childhood experience. That's before COVID. In Florida, it's more than 1/2. And by the way, in an average class of 28 students, 7 Florida students would have 2 or more ACEs, and 3 students would have ongoing weekly trauma. And by the way, if you look at a classroom, for instance, one of our statutory reading classrooms, you can just double those data points. And the key here is that so many of our students are dealing with underlying things. We have to be aware of them and ready to intervene and report on them, do something about them at any given moment. Today, I would note, I think that the vast majority of our students have had some kind of novel or traumatic event, given what's happening with the COVID era. And by the way, that doesn't mean that someone died or even got sick, but we've taken our students and we have placed them inside of a home where their parents are also going crazy. And there's so much that we know is happening in the mental health of those students and those kids. So adverse childhood experiences is another element we want to be aware of. And again, we'll provide you with some information if you want to actually evaluate that. This screen actually shows an emoji-based system for capturing where students are in the realm of social emotional awareness and also engagement measurement. This is from a piece of software called Rhythm, which I actually give you free if you are interested in this. They ask questions like, what's it like in your head today? Is it dull? Is it focused? Is it racing? How's your body feel? Are you sick today? Are you hungry? Are you feeling great? How's your social life going? Bad? Is there disagreement? Is there conflict? Or maybe it's going great. Or how do you feel? Are you sad? Are you anxious? Or you're angry? This is a screen. This is actually real life data, which was for a presentation that they did for the entire state of Alabama, looking at hunger awareness and then also the other kinds of risk alerts. You could do this zip code by zip code. You could have an understanding of your neighborhoods where kids are hungry or kids are having really very specific kinds of challenges. And by the way, another kind of report is to think about where are your kids versus your teachers. I just want to pause here because as we think about trauma awareness, the kinds of things that might be happening in our schools, we often think about students having challenges, but what about our teachers? So if you look at this here, just take a minute, who do you think is the teacher and who do you think is the student? And who's doing better or worse? Because in this particular instance, the teacher is the orange, the student is the blue. Look here at your emotion. Who's happy? I have significantly more students that report being happy than teachers. My teachers are more likely to be anxious. And by the way, that again, this was actually real-time data. Being able to look at the gap between my teachers and my kids. It's really hard to be an effective teacher if I have a lot of anxiety. And today, as we think about teachers going back into classrooms, we have a lot of teachers that are very fearful of what might be happening in the fall. By the way, this really corroborates some of the data we found when we were writing Hall. We didn't know we were going to be releasing it during the COVID crisis, but over the last 3 years, what we found was that schools that were outperforming their zip codes were schools that were paying a special attention to the stress levels of their teachers first, and then dealing with the stressors of kids. And you can find more about that. There are actually some free downloads at habitatforheroes.org. Teacher stress is a precursor to student stress. So when we think about what it means to be aware, I have a variety of things we just ran through, thinking, first of all, there are lots of different kinds of trauma that I should be aware of, I should be planning for. I can use some of the FBI guidance around that. I can use some of the information around adverse childhood experiences, or I could even use a piece of software like the Rhythm software to identify what's going on in the student's head, or by the way, in the faculty's head. Rhythm is used also with adults. But then I need to know what to do. Not only should I have some general awareness, but I need to know what to look for, right? And that gets to some of that FBI information. I need to have the ability to immediately act. I need to have an autonomic reflex. The urgent can be routine. It can become a routine response, but I have to build that muscle memory because our brains are literally wired that when there's a traumatic event, I'm going to get the heck out of there or I'm going to freeze. That's actually biological. I want to think about how I create a culture of caring and compassion and concern. So again, I can bring these things to the fore. I want to be aware of stress. I want to be able to identify it. Also be aware of issues with self-regulation with students, especially. That can be true with faculty, but with students. And to create de-escalation experts in the classroom. And by the way, going back to the issue of school violence or school shooting, you probably have read about some of the incidents that were resolved without anyone getting hurt because you had a de-escalation expert who was a teacher and the teacher was able to talk the student down. These are the kinds of skills we need to be thinking about and working towards, but they don't happen in a day of PD. That's actually why we created a graduate level course with USC. It takes time. It takes a variety of different kinds of skills and drills. My colleagues at the Successful Practices Network have looked at this, and they actually identify things like resilience factors. What are the adult relationships? So the relationships between adults and students. If I don't have a caring relationship, that student is much more likely to take their trauma and keep it bottled inside. It's more likely to explode, all right? Do we have a secure, accepting environment, which means not only things like less bullying, no bullying, but I'm having a problem at home. I know I have someone to speak with, all right? A strengths-based approach, which actually, if you look at things like Gallup's Core Clarity or Strengths Finder, is a way of understanding the differences in a classroom. And then a variety of options. Options not only academically, but options in my discipline, options in self-management. And by the way, I would note that really great academic programs actually decrease the number of students that are going to the office or that are in some kind of disciplinary challenge. And then lastly, awareness of and orientation toward others. So I'm aware of that, I'm responding to that. I need to develop skills that my team can use, but they can use in an operational way really quickly. Purposeful practices that alleviate the effects of trauma, de-escalation, which I've already talked about, skills to help me return to normal operation once something traumatic happens. And then systematic operation at the classroom level for intervention and for treatment. It is not enough to simply have a strategic plan at the district level and nothing more. I want to point out what this might look like by actually taking you through a real life school shooter by the second scenario. And this becomes important as we think about the kinds of things that we need to be aware of and also report to, all right? Because awareness isn't the same as a report or as an understanding. And then the kinds of skills we need to make sure we can automatically implement. So in this instance, which by the way, again, this was a real life incident, the student who is the school shooter arrived at the school at 2:19 p.m. in 54 seconds. They were actually viewed by a security officer carrying a rifle bag. The security officer radioed a second security officer, but there was no alarm. Nobody did anything. And this is part of this idea of Alyssas Law. I need to alarm. By the way, that security person was out in the parking lot, and that's going to be an important point in a moment. They entered the school and they were spotted by a second person as they were carrying that rifle bag. The second person actually didn't do anything. They made a note of it. They didn't report that, they didn't scream or anything like that. The student goes into a stairwell and they actually see a friend of theirs. And they say, listen, things are gonna get really bad around here. You need to get out of here. That student runs, and they actually run and they find a staff who has a radio and they say, listen, so-and-so has a gun. So now I have a staff with a radio, all right? There's still no alert. The first shots were fired on the first floor of the school. 3 students were killed. They were in the hallway. And then that shooter was going into the classrooms and they were shooting into the classrooms. Staff person hears shots. They actually run into a second floor closet to hide. Still no alert, no 911, no, we're not locked down yet. Finally, I have the first 911 call, but that 911 call, which doesn't tell anything, nobody in the building knows what's going on, except the person who made that call. It didn't actually go to the first responders, to the nearest responders, because of the way 911 works, okay? And then the shooter pulled a fire alarm. So the shooter goes to the second floor. On the second floor, the teachers had heard something. They had been alerted, and they had time to close their doors. And literally, if you look at the FBI reports, school shooting after school shooting, it's about closing the door, pulling down the shade. There are actually 0 casualties on the second floor. There was an automatic response because they had a little bit of information. Close your door. The third floor, however, was filled with evacuating students. No one knew what was going on. The shooter goes up to the third floor. It's like a shooting gallery, and that's actually where the majority of casualties happen, all right? Finally, the sheriff is on the way after it's all done. like literally the sheriff is on the way after. And if you look at, and by the way, code red is finally initiated in that building. And if you look at the asterisks here, the asterisks are all the times when there might have been an alert. But I want to note that the alert wasn't out to the sheriff, all right? The first 911 call was at 2:22:13. The alert has to be to all the people in the building to close your door, pull down the shade, something is happening. To all the people in the building to lock it down. And my point here is that alerting is different from awareness. Also, by the way, alerting has to happen from everywhere, including from, for instance, the parking lot or places where I don't know that I'm going to have cell phone coverage, right? How many of us have been in a part of our school buildings where my cell phone doesn't work, especially if it's an older building? This becomes really important. Awareness can begin long before the traumatic event. In this case, awareness of what was going on actually began significantly before, because this student was known to have problems and there had been calls in to an FBI hotline, et cetera. But after the event, no one was really shocked that this student had a problem. But awareness and alerting are different. And the thing that was important in what I just took you through was that teachers became aware and they knew what to do immediately. That's different from just saying, hey, someone is somewhere, we need to do something. What is happening? Where is it happening? What do I need to do? And what are others doing? These are 4 key critical components. By the way, a panic button like that pull down alarm can be a tragic button without skill and without readiness. And that's what happened there. I had a panic button, right? I heard something and all of a sudden all the kids in the 3rd floor corridor are coming out, and that actually led to tragedy. Remember, the human brain is designed to shut down during a crisis. I not only need to alert, but I need to make people aware, and I need to make sure that folks know and are reiterated in exactly what to do, a process. And I want to talk about that for a minute, because what we do, how we alert, how we help people to become aware becomes really critical. On your screen, you have data from the University of Central Florida, Nicholson School of Communication. They've done a lot of research on what literally happens when we are presented with information in a high stress environment. We receive and process 1/2 to 1/3 the amount of information we normally take in. And we process it at a level about 4 grade levels below where we normally take in information. Our brain is hardwired to do that because all of a sudden our brain is literally bathed in stress hormones that say fight, flee, or freeze. We need to make sure that as we are alerting, we are supporting the people receiving that alert with information on exactly what to do. We're actually supporting a very specific, drilled in process. By the way, most shootings at school are not in a school building. Most shootings happen in the parking lot. I'm so sorry, there was thunder. I don't know if you heard that, if you saw me shake. It's traumatic. We're going to get another thunder boomer here in the afternoon in Florida. So I hope it doesn't interfere with my recording. Most shootings at school are not in the building. They happen in the parking lot. They happen at the football field. They happen in the stadium. Again, I want to know places where I may well not have great cell phone reception. Also places where I might not have my cell phone readily available. And that's important because lots of people are talking about cell phone alerts. And even when they're in the building, most shootings at school are not in a classroom. They are not where I'm going to be even near a phone, like a hardwired phone. And most shootings have a lot of time where the shooter actually ended up fleeing. So this all helps us understand some of the kinds of things we have to be ready for. But let's think about things that aren't necessarily shootings, okay? Because a focus on alerting and awareness and responding to school shootings can actually obscure the real need in schools. Did you know that up to 1/4 of all childhood injuries happen at school? Allergies, seizures, broken bones, shortness of breath, these are all the kinds of traumatic events that our schools respond to every single day. 65% of school nurses manage a life-threatening event annually. And while 85% of schools have a medical emergency response plan, fewer than a third of those schools actually ever practice that plan, even know what that plan is. And nearly 3/4 of schools do not have an adequate campus communication plan around these kinds of emergencies. By the way, this is information from the journal Pediatrics. So let's think about a different kind of event, not a school shooter. I want you to imagine that I have a student, student X, and they have an acute anaphylactic attack. This is death within 15 minutes or less. They were in building A on the 3rd floor in one of 2 boys' bathrooms. So they're in one of the boys' bathrooms. Student Y saw them, goes to find the teacher and says, hey, this student is sick. They don't know what's going on. What's going to happen to that teacher? Are they going to know immediately what to do? Are they going to be able to go? Are they going to go into the bathroom? Are they going to find that student? Who are they going to respond to? Are they going to take their phone to respond? Complex actions in this particular instance. For instance, is that teacher going to think about taking their EpiPen? Will the student have an EpiPen with them? Complex actions are not reliable. If I'm going back to my classroom, am I going to find my phone? Am I going to do 5 clicks to figure it out? I'm going to say, oh my gosh, here's the issue. And am I going to be able to relay, there's a medical emergency. It's teacher Smith. I'm in the 3rd floor and that emergency is happening in the bathroom. What do I say? What do I do? Who do I call? When we think about what real trauma readiness is, and the difference between just sending out an alert, by the way, in that shooter example, I had an alert, I pulled the alarm, to actually having awareness and readiness. Readiness means I know what to do, and I have a means of letting everyone else know what's going on, specifically what's going on and where it's happening, so they can also take the exact and specific kind of action that I need. Again, it could be bullying. It could be a medical emergency. It could be what happens, hey, I have a student coming back to school today and there was a sudden death in the family. It could be a hurricane or a fire, or it could be an event like violence. Just focusing on school shootings can get in the way of really thinking about what trauma looks like and our readiness for. And right now, because right now as our kids and our staff are coming back to school, what happens if one of our teachers has a panic attack? Because that is actually a kind of trauma that we should be aware of and ready for. Now here in Florida and in other states, but I'm going to speak to Florida, we have a new law. It's called Alyssas Law. Alyssas Law is in the health, safety, and welfare section of the code. And it says that we need to have some kind of panic alert system and other strategies. But I want to note that Alyssas Law is very specific, very narrow, and it just says we're going to connect the public safety authorities. Remember my example? By the time the sheriff was on their way, it was all over. It had already been done. The most important thing, if we are serious about preventing tragedy, is to make sure that all of our teachers know exactly what's going on and what to do, and our first responders in the building and what to do, where it is, to activate an actual response. This is the actual requirement out of that law. In our analysis here, and by the way, the center, we actually helped create a set of requirements that were used by Atlanta Public Schools in putting together an RFP for this kind of system. And we'll make an offer. We'll connect you to the folks who've been working with Hillsborough County here in Florida. Number one, that idea of alerting, it has to be accessible everywhere. I have to know that all of the adults inside of my building have immediate access to an alerting function, all right? The coverage has to be everywhere. I can't be worrying about, do I have coverage with my cell phone right now? If I'm out in the parking lot, do I have cell coverage? If I'm out at the football field, do I have coverage? I have to know. And by the way, this is actually a legal issue for our school districts, right? It would not be okay if our school districts were implementing something and all of a sudden there wasn't coverage. I couldn't make an alert. It has to be usable. I can't have too many false alerts. And I can't have 5 different clicks in. 1 click, or 2 clicks. I need to be able to provide adequate information. And that means it isn't just, hey, school shooting on the campus. By the way, the actual event that I was taking you through there, that was Parkland. And you might know that when the first responders showed up, they actually went to the wrong building, first of all. And it isn't just the building. What floor? Who was making that alert? Always available, all right? What if I didn't have my phone was off? Or if I have a battery alert system and the battery is dead? We cannot allow that to happen. But most of all, if you hear anything I'm saying, we have to support human action. Because even if you have the best alerting system in the world, the brain during a traumatic event is going to shut down. And I have to be supporting that procedure. So we are very, we recommend against the idea of a cell phone alerting process. I might not have my phone isn't maintained by my district. I don't know if there's phone signal. I don't know that my phone has power. I don't know that it was recharged. Can I quickly find the app, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Too many problems. Please, I want you to consider, is the alerting system provided by the school? Is it a dedicated system just for that? It's not rechargeable. It doesn't have batteries. It's actually designed to be worn. I always have it on me no matter what. If I'm in the bathroom, I have it on me. If I had gone into the bathroom and I saw that student were in anaphylactic shock, I had it on me. I can click and not only will people come, but I could click, for instance, twice, which is it's a medical emergency. And my receptor picked it up and said, I'm near that bathroom on the 2nd floor. Not dependent upon cellular service. And it explicitly supports my school's emergency response protocol. In other words, when I click and say, hey, we got a school shooting, everybody in the building immediately is alerted and knows what to do. As a matter of fact, my PA system would say, we're in a code red, and everyone knows what to do. All right? Supported also by trauma readiness certification. Again, this is not something you're going to learn in one day of PD. Trauma readiness certification means that I'm building autonomic responses at the classroom level that I know, I've drilled them. I know they're going to happen. And that's really what we think about as being really ready. I know that I'm going to have classroom level experts in awareness, what to look for, including prevention. I know that they are going to be fluent in the skills for response. And I know that the operational plan is at that classroom level of readiness. So I want to support you in getting ready. If you're interested in a district-specific planning session, the center will actually provide that out for free. We'll connect you with that. You can email ruth@edcenter.org, kim@edcenter.org. If you wanted to have a consultation with Hillsborough County's vendor, they're called Strategics or CTS, we'll connect you with that. They can actually take you to what's happening at Hillsborough County. We created an RFP template that Atlanta and others have used. We'll send that to you. We're also willing to connect you with that software Rhythm for free. If you're interested in learning more about graduate level certification in trauma readiness with the University of Southern California, Rossier. By the way, the first 4 things are free. The graduate level program obviously has expense. We actually provide you with that program underwriting, so you can do that for literally 1/3 of the cost. I think the way it works out is an entire skill could be certified, what normally a person would have to get. And then lastly, our partners at Meteor Education, who are actually sponsoring today, can help you with an on-site environment assessment. Are you ready? What do you need to think about in your school for trauma? And that's both prevention, engagement, as well as awareness and alerting. So I hope today has not only been interesting, provided you with some things to think about. You'll receive in the follow-up a recording of today's session. Also the slides, and then the FBI information, those white papers, information on adverse childhood experiences, and then the RFP template and ways that you can contact, again, ruth@edcenter.org, kim@edcenter.org, to think about how you take the next step in moving forward, getting your campus ready. All right.
I have a question here from Wendy Warren, and she asked, what's meant by latent trauma versus secondary trauma?
Great. Great question. Thank you, Wendy. So latent trauma is trauma that could be in a student or in a faculty person. And it's actually something happened long ago or something happened in the past and it's triggered, okay? So it's latent, it's hidden. For instance, an example of this would be, imagine that in this COVID time, my mom died. And I come back to school. My staff aren't necessarily aware of that. I've been a high-performing student, all right? Yeah, but something happens in the classroom and triggers it, and I have an outburst, all right? I have an outburst. That trauma is latent. It's in the past, and it's hidden. Secondary trauma is different. Secondary trauma is the trauma that caregivers experience because they are caring for. It's the same kind of trauma that nurses go through. And I read something yesterday, which is a really good example of this. And it was a story of someone that said, I finally called my workplace trauma number because I was at wit's end. And I called into the trauma to talk to the counselor. And I was talking about all the things happening. And then I brought up race. And the caregiver actually started crying. So it's that caregiver's response. And right now, and we found this in the book when we were doing the research for Whole, that there's an enormous amount of secondary trauma experienced by teachers and counselors and administrators. Teachers are the 4th most stressed occupation in the United States. And there was actually a study that was done looking at the levels of the stress hormone cortisol amongst a variety of different populations. And teachers had higher levels of the stress hormone in their blood than did soldiers returning from the battlefield. So secondary trauma is a different kind of trauma. And by the way, I treat these differently. For latent trauma, I might think about having wraparound services at school. For instance, in back to school right now, I might have a lot of wraparound for my students. Maybe I make sure that all of my students have some kind of consultation with a counselor. I'm checking in with them every day. Rhythm is a way to get at what's happening kind of in the background, right? Secondary trauma is different. Secondary trauma is something that I might take care of. For instance, morning meetings with my principal. Let's do a check-in. How's everyone feeling? Anybody amongst my faculty? I had to deal with something really hard yesterday. Let's make sure that we're, talking that out, making sure if you need help, teachers, call the hotline, or we have resource here, wraparound services literally for the teachers. That's secondary trauma. Great question. And again, by the way, I want to remind all of us that if we think about things like bullying, if we think about inappropriate actions by staff, our staff can become abusive, our staff can have inappropriate sexual contact, all of these kinds of things. Dealing with latent trauma or dealing with secondary trauma becomes important as a part of that prevention. And actually the FBI white papers, which are really, again, thinking about school shootings, are really about how do I identify latent trauma and some of those risk factors there. Any other questions? I can look at the chat now. Okay, great. Well, again, I hope folks found this interesting and look forward to speaking with you and sending out that information. And maybe we'll see you in one of those classes. Oh yes, best practice using rhythm. Wendy is my questioner today. So Wendy, so this is really interesting. Rhythm it is originally designed for students. Best practice would be to, for instance, let's say you had your kids and they were working at home, all right? Have your students check in at least in the mornings. But best practice would actually have your students check in 2 or 3 times during the day. Because what happens is I might start the day really great, but then by middle of the day, things aren't so great. And by the end of the day, things are really, they've just all gone completely. And by the way, in the school setting, the recommendation is have the students, as they are literally coming into your classroom, for instance, if it's a middle school classroom, they've been through a few classes, you know, they're going around, just have them check in really fast. And they can check in if they have a laptop, if they have a device, or they can even check in behind, you know, at like a computer station in the back of the room. We've actually done this with adults, and it is really fascinating. Asking your adults to check in using the Rhythm software before their day begins and at their end of the day is really profoundly interesting for the leader to help understand what's happening to their teachers or what's happening to their employees. For instance, imagine a teacher is coming in and they're all gung-ho and they're saying, hey, I'm doing really great. I'm ready for today. And then you have them check in at the end of the day and they are literally just destroyed. They're destroyed emotionally. They are hungry. They are tired. That gives you a real sense of what's happening. And by the way, ways to help those teachers. And because you can see into that teacher, you can provide supports for that teacher, right? I can check in with them. By the way, make sure, and I know this sounds crazy, but we do a lot to make sure that our kids aren't hungry. Our teachers, at the end of the day, could literally be starving. I could take you to places where this is true. Or teachers that are really, they're literally ready to break down into tears and they need an intervention at the end of the school day before they go home. These are real life scenarios I'm taking you through. So again, having them check in at least during the beginning of the day, but if you have beginning and end of the day, both with kids and with teachers is important. And then look at that. You can see that information in real time and getting the leadership team together and looking at it and asking, you know, how can we help, right? How can we help? Great question. All right, I think that is where we are for today. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you again. Ruth at edcenter.org, Kim at edcenter.org. Please reach out. Be happy to help you. Take care.